Okay, so I start with George Washington. Yeah,
Yes.
and I was a painting major in college, in graduate school in Temple University, and but I was literally painting the landscape with a brush, like out in the field, you know, with a paintbrush, and I was painting a line that is 1 meter wide by 1 hour. So I would time myself, and for 1 hour I would paint this line in the field, and then I also painted these squares on the bushes the same way, and this one was dedicated to Solowit, who came to my school at the time, and I met him in 1969, and we stayed friends all the time. So this is one painting that I did, but the other painting was in fields. But in one field, the painting went over the field, down in a little valley, and there was a stream, a little stream, and the paint went in the stream, but it just flowed away. Yeah. And then I kept on going. So I decided to paint 1 hour completely in water. You know, just everything that would flow away as soon as I was dripping the paint, it would go away. And so the only place, I was in Philadelphia in graduate school in 1969, and the only place that I could think that would take me 1 hour to cross was the Delaware River. But it just so happens that there's a famous spot in the Delaware River where George Washington crossed to win the Revolutionary War. And it's a big event in American history, the crossing of the Delaware from George Washington. So I walked into the water. It was March, I think, and I went into the water with just the cans of paint and my camera. But at some point, I didn't know it became deep, and I went down with the cans of paint and things like this. And so I had to take the paint. It was big gallons of paint, and I had to take that off my belt. And I lost my camera, but I continued crossing the Delaware. But I realized that all I had was the story, because I didn't have the photograph, nothing like this. And so that was, so then I decided, well, maybe I should do something more with George Washington, and then that's when I took this picture. And this is just I had long hair, and I just teased it and put baby powder, and this is a raincoat and a white shirt. It's not a costume, you know. It was just, and then I did a few other things with George Washington. I signed my name like George Washington with fancy letters and things like this, and that was pretty much the beginning of my career, my professional career with this thing, and it was.
But when you started to paint on the land, were you thinking about being a land artist, or?
It was 1968, 69, and it was the time I knew Dennis Oppenheim and my friend Peter Hutchinson and things like this, and it was the time when it was conceptual artists kind of doing things, but the thing that I felt was a problem was that the things that were shown in the gallery were documentation. You know, they weren't the real thing was out in the landscape, which almost no one saw, and so I really wanted to get away from like documentation, because I thought it was secondary to the real thing, and this is, and also documentation depended on. There was, by the way, no Photoshop, none, like this, and it depended on the fact that the artist was telling the truth with documentation and things like this. You know, I mean, documentation is supposed to be true, but somehow in my head, then I was thinking, and so this is not documentation. This is a photograph, a fictional photograph of me, and that's when I started my narrative work, and the narrative work. You know, it came after like the conceptual documentation, but the narrative work, it didn't matter if it was true or not. It just mattered if it was a good story.
Yeah.
And that's how I began. And then I decided on different ways of writing stories, and this is one of the best pieces with a story about de Kooning, and but also. But this is the one I like. It's a story for Popsicle, where the story is written on the wrapper. But to finish the story, you had to lick the popsicle so that the rest of the story could be seen on the stick.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Mm.
But again, it was just also a way of me getting into like making an art object rather than art documentation. It's not documentation. And this is 1971. This is 1971. And then after that, I just simply wrote fictional stories with photographs, you know, and the story changes the idea of the photograph, and the photograph changes the idea of the story, and they both kind of go together, you know. And this was before that, the 1971. With this woman, she was a curator, and her name was Alana Heiss.
She became then director of the PS1?
Yes.
Yeah.
But before she was a director, she curated this show on the Brooklyn Bridge, where she invited artists to do different projects on the Brooklyn Bridge. And my project was to put these swings from the bridge, and on the top of the bridge there was dead fish and things like that in a bucket to attract the seagulls. So above there was the seagulls, and below there was the swings. It was like these two movements, something like this. And this was
so these are swings.
Yeah, these are the swings, and you don't see.
Why did you choose the swings?
Because of the movement.
Because of the
movement. And because it's a childlike thing with a children's thing that is like fun and playful, you know.
Okay.
And I was doing a lot of things that were a little bit playful, like and also with the popsicles and you know, just different things that maybe like innocent children could appreciate.
Nice.
Yeah. And then in 1971, 72, I started writing these stories. And again, the stories, these stories started out, first of all, this is called The Avoidance of Anne. That's the title. And I had no idea what the story would be, but so I just wrote the title, and then I decided to figure out how to explain the title with the text. But again, it's fictional, but that's An Avoidance of Anne, and I did I think 6 or 7 of these stories, and this was my first show in a gallery in New York in 1973 with John Gibson.
Okay.
Yeah.
And The Avoidance of Anne, what is about this story?
The Avoidance of Anne is trying to avoid a woman named Anne. But it also, in the story, there was no nouns with vowels. So in other words, like if I was telling the story and I wanted to say like an inner tube, I wouldn't say inner tube because it has the word Anne in front of it. So it was avoiding the word Anne in the language, but also avoiding a fictional person named Anne as well. And that was one of the 6 stories that looked like this. That was one of the 6 stories that looked like this in my first gallery show in New York at John Gibson. Before that, in 1970, I was very frequently showing at 112 Green Street. It was like it was the new place to kind of show, and Gordon Matta and Louise Bourgeois and people were making. We would just go in, make a project, and leave, and it was very informal. But from 1970 to 73, I was showing at 112 Green Street, completely not commercial, you know. And then, but this was my first show in 1973, I think, no, 72, at John Gibson Gallery. So, but all the titles, I would write the title, Avoidance of Anne, and there was a very good one called The Origin of Anne. The Origin of Anne. And this was a story about, it's hard to explain, but it was a story about a monk, and he was going up in a basket to on the cliff, and then he got to the top of the cliff, and he got to the top of the cliff, but then the rope broke, and he was falling, and he was followed by all the fruits and vegetables that were in his basket. So the monks on the middle level, they heard this word, and they saw all these things falling, and so they associated the word and with the multiplicity, many things. And this was the first fictional story, and then I wrote about 6 more, you know, and this is 1971, 72, something like this. It was the beginning of my narrative art.
Okay.
Yeah.
And going through also this one, for example.
Yeah. So I mean, this does come from possibly some kind of experience that I remember, but it's basically fictional. It's again, it's not documentation.
Okay.
And then this comes from there's a saying in English, you can't have your cake and eat it too, and then this was kind of inspired by this saying.
Okay.
Yeah, that's Switzerland. Yeah. So the other thing, there's a stem here. You can't, but so this comes from some of the pieces didn't have language, but they were still narrative. But this comes from roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. It's a children's poem. So here's a rose, here's a violet, and then sugar is sweet. You sweet doesn't have a color, but I made it from Barnett Newman's Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue. He did in the last works that Barnett Newman did, who I liked very much, were vertical things, and they were all red, yellow, and blue, because there was this idea that somehow if you're a painter, you shouldn't use the primary colors. I mean, this was a thing at the time, you know. So he used the primary colors, and he called the series of works right before he died, Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue? And, you know, and so this was inspired by the title, and also roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet. But again, it's like the vertical kind of things of Barnett Newman. You know, he never did horizontals because he thought that it would become a landscape. So all his things were vertical. I mean, particularly at the end of his life. And this is Paris Bistro. And it was a restaurant in the West Village, and the idea was that so this is a rectangle, and this is like a stop sign, but this sign is reflected in this photograph here. So it wasn't the shape of the sign, but the sign itself is reflected here in the photograph. But in all of these, I wanted the physical work of the photograph to be the art. Because at the time, conceptual artists were kind of saying, well, I'm not working with, it was a time of political unrest and things like that. Nixon was, I think, president. And artists were rebelling against the establishment. And they were saying, we are not making objects. But they were making objects. They were photographs. They're just thin objects, you know. And so I was concerned with making. The photograph be an object, besides being a photograph. And in many of the works, see in this one, which is one of my favorite, the drop and bucket. I mean, the thing that funnels the drop. See, here's a square, here's a triangle, and here's a circle. But so the thing that funnels the drop into the bucket is the shape of the photograph. It's like a funnel, you know. And so again, it had something to do with the photograph being an object that in not just documentation. Yeah. And which I was trying to get away from. I thought it was, and then this was obviously one of my best ones, and it's in the Museum of Modern Art, and it's edition of 3 and some other places as well. But this also had to do with Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue. But it's like here's the faucet with the hot with the red signified by red. Here's the cold signified by blue, but they're going together into a drain that is not a combination of red. It's not a combination of red and blue. The water must be coming warm here, like, you know, between this and this, but this is not like a combination of the two colors. It's a little hard to explain, but this is what I always had to have, some kind of idea to kind of start. You know, and then this also at the time, very many artists were Marxists, and I understand why, and I'm sympathetic to the idea and things like that. But they were obsessively Marxist, and again with Marxism, the whole idea was that there was no commodity, you can't sell anything or anything like this. And this is a really nice idea, except that it doesn't work because you need money to live and eat. And so I took this Marxist guy here, and this was in the paper in the New York Post in 1975 or something like this. And I wrote a story about a newspaper, and this is a street light, and this is a field, but I decided to take the newspaper about Mao dead as I could have taken any newspaper, you know. It was just a story about a newspaper, and anyway, so I keep going. The other thing was that also in the 70s, the conceptual artists were a little puritanical, and so I wanted to take a little bit of the puritanical out of the work, and so I did these legs, and these are scratches on a. By the way, I must say, in a humble way, Jeff Koons really liked this work, because it in a little way it took out the puritanical aspect of the conceptual work at the time, and of course he did it like really well. Yeah. And then this is Deirdre's Lip, and I was actually married for a year to a woman named Deirdre, and this is her lip. The whole idea was that the idea of something being cold and then the breath coming out and making in the cold air the breaths here, but then here you have like also like a kind of a vapor of the train. So you have here the vapor of the train and the mouth, and then the three things there, and these things are associated with the air was cold. A casual passerby could have heard disconnected words spoken from the phone booth. Forget, twilight, darling. And so these are meant to be the representations of forget, twilight, darling with the breath, the visual, you know. And then this I took in Tortola in the Caribbean when I was there with my friend Mac Adams, and it had to do with, you know, here the sun is rising and the coconut is falling, and it just had to do with the dialogue of the one going up and one going down, and both being kind of circles. And maybe I'll one more, and so then. So this was a typical and good text piece, now owned by Jeff Koons, where there was a triangle of a shoulder blade, and then the circle of the nipple, and then this barrier here, like kind of in between. It says a bar of soap passed over the nipple of a breast, a circle erogenous zone stimulated, it stood erect. Later, the bar of soap passed over another area, triangular on her back. The bathtub was set in Berlin. The city had been zoned after the war. Roads leading from one area to another had been blocked by gut gates. Later bays she crossed. So, I mean, basically I was writing a story and taking the photographs at the same time, and then at some point, after about 5 or 10 studies, I arrived at the final, and then, so those were some of my best pieces from the early 70s, which really did influence, this is a really good, I think, piece, which really influenced the work that was in the show.
Okay.
Yeah. So this one is called just Neapolitan Holidays, which is definitely ironic, which I actually learned later because of this postcard, which was sent during World War I, or the Great War. And the interesting thing about this postcard that we spoke about was that I think the postcard was sent one place, and then he wasn't there, the receiver wasn't there, and then it was sent to another place. It was, yeah, and it finally was in the hospital or something like this where you are. It's kind of ironic in a beautiful way, because it's called Neapolitan Holidays, and so each one of these had a postcard that inspired me from the group of works that you and Lucia sent me. I mean, it was amazing. I have to send it back, but it's like hundreds and hundreds of fantastic postcards from 1915 to 1950, something like this. All your family postcards. And then, then I wrote this somewhat happy story about, trying to catch the ferry, and then I just had this idea that these are very difficult shoes to run in, and so and that's the water looking down from the ferry actually, and so this is the way that the pieces started with a postcard, and then I wrote the text, and then I thought of the photographs for the piece. Same with the rest. By the way, I picked out. There was hundreds and hundreds of postcards, but I picked out the ones that first of all visually looked good, and then Lucia like translated a whole bunch, and then I used the ones from the translation. I mean, it didn't matter what the postcard said, you know. And this is different than my earlier work in the sense that the earlier work did have text, but they weren't stimulated, or you know, they didn't start with a postcard, you know, and an old postcard. And this is just called the Cambridge Trampoline Society, and a trampoline is this round thing that you just bounce up and down on, and so it has to do with some kind of movement, and also going across the movement this way, and also going across the sea, like kind of this way. This is Capri, I guess. And I wanted to make my text. So this is a postcard, and this is like postcards were early text messages, or text messages are late postcards. Now, not many people send postcards; they just send text. So the postcard is answered by the text within 100 years later. So. And then, so that's the same format that I used for all of these things, with a postcard from early postcard, and then my that's why I have like a time on it, because actually text and things like that have specific kind of times on it, and but this, you know, this is a very specific kind of time, but it's like 100 years later than or something like that when this was written. And so that was the structure for all of the pieces. I particularly like this photograph of this sad little girl here. And the other thing that was I found that was poignant about the postcards that I had from Naples was that several of them came right in the middle of the First War, you know, so that they were sent to people in a time that must have been incredible, you know, it was called the Great War, because they didn't know there was going to be a second war, so they called it, you know, and so this was in 1915, and this was this year sometime when it was written. And so it's a text message versus a postcard. And I'm glad you chose this for different things. And the same with the bicycle. And David Carrier really liked this, and he also liked that I chose this painting from. It's in.
Caravaggio, Piemonte, Milano, si ricorda,
yeah. So again, I chose the postcards visually and things like that seemed interesting, and then Lucia translated, and then I responded, not so directly, but you know, with a text message many years later. You know, the person that wrote this is certainly not alive anymore, probably. But.
And the picture are then associated in some way?
In some way, yeah. The pictures are here. I mean, here here it is talking about a grinding stone. You know, so there's some mention of what's it. Here's something that's like heavy, and here's something that's light. You know, the feather, and the heavy things on the top. And so they were in some ways. Well, here it talks about Virgil's bees, and there's some bees. You know, so there was definitely relationship.
And here, why did you associate the sign?
It's a stop sign. Yeah, I'm not. I can't explain that at the moment.
Okay.
I really like the image of it, and every photograph that I took was taken in Naples. You know, and here's a tomato, and this was this must be taken in Naples too. It's written in Italian. So and also it does have to do with just simply looking at the overall piece and hopefully finding pleasure in just the relationship of everything together. I mean, I really like this detail here, and then the printing, and then this is from a church in Naples. The colors there. Yeah, that's.
Are you happy about the show?
I'm extremely happy about the show. I think it could be the best show I've ever done, or really up in the top 2 or 3. Yeah.
Great. Fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, and it's nice the way that it evolved. I mean, like 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago, we spoke about maybe doing something again and things like that. And we also spoke about text and writing and things like this. And then it started sinking in my head, and I'm extremely happy about the show. Yeah.
And how did it come up, the idea of the postcards?
The idea, well, Lucia sent me like a 500 or 1,000 postcards, and I like the idea of starting with like this. See, the other thing is, even in my early work, my work before, everything that I wrote was basically the length of a postcard. You know, even in like works much earlier, the text was never long. It just, everything completed itself within a short text. So it was kind of like, I didn't think of it at the time, but it was kind of like writing a postcard, because it was just a short text. And the other thing that's interesting about postcards is that almost always when you write a postcard, it has nothing to do with the picture on the other side. You might say a happy Merry Christmas. I don't know what, but it can relate to the what's on the other side, and maybe it doesn't have any relationship at all, which is something I liked. Yeah. But it was, I mean, the postcards came from your family postcards, all of them. You know. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very moving for us.
Yeah, I know, because when we stood and even like just a day or so ago, and when you were speaking about the things that you recognize and things like that, it's a whole other different experience, because I don't have that. I was taking the postcards for other, I knew where they came from, but I was taking it for, I didn't know all the intimate like things, you know.
Great. Thank you.
And also, by the way, I mean, the people in the show, I saw that they were pointing out different people that were their cousins and things like that.
Fantastic.
So, I don't know, I think it worked.
Grazie, Bill. Thank you.
Grazie.